from City Tito Blogs and welcome to my channel BA Artifact series. And today we are going to look into API contract and API documentation along with the examples of YAML and JSON format files to understand how we can learn the API contracts if we are on the project. Before we deep dive into the API contract, I would like to request everyone to please like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and let's get started. So, API contract is basically created by the developers and architects based on the business requirements provided by the business analyst. So, they serve as a source of truth and they define request structure, which includes fields, data types, and mandatory or optional fields, and expected response structure, error handling, data formats, and the business rules, validation rules. So it is useful for the developers and system to follow a strict agreement before the implementation, before and during the implementation. So it is very important to define a API contract first in the beginning of the API lifecycle. And then the API documentation will be created by the technical people. So now let's discuss about the API documentation. So API documentation is also created by the developers, and they serves as a user manual, which helps us to understand how the APIs can be used. And with an examples, they will explain what are the different endpoints and different HTTP methods like get, post, put, patch, delete methods. All the examples for all these methods, request parameters, what are the request parameters, request payload, response payload, and different status codes like the 200 series, which is success, and all the 400 series error codes, all 500 server error code series. And also they provide the error messages and error handling, and authentication details, how to connect to the API provider, what are the headers that we have to include in order to communicate with the APIs. So, to explain you the flow of overall the end-to-end API lifecycle from the business analyst point of view, you could say something like this. Like as a business analyst, I gather and analyze the requirements, and once they are refined and validated by the stakeholders, I collaborate closely with the technical team to define the API contracts and by identifying the data types, request response structure, validation rules, and to ensure there is a completeness and support data mapping between the systems. So at this earlier stage, I focus mainly on accuracy and correctness, and and I make sure that API contracts serves as a source of truth. So it's the initial truth that it's an agreement for the developers to follow in order to make the implementation correctly, right? And then the developers or the architects would formally develop API contracts in their design process using open API tools. And once the contract is ready, I review this contract along with the technical team to ensure there is an alignment with the business requirements, and also to ensure it covers all the scenarios before the implementation. So once this contract is finalized, the developers or technical people would create APIs based on the contract. And they also create API documentation using Swagger. And this API documentation serves like a user manual, which provides you different examples and usage of API, like all the request response, payloads, error handling, and and mainly the authentication details to how to connect to the APIs. So as a business analyst, I also validate API documentation to ensure it is matching the business requirements and is easy for stakeholders and consumers to understand. So this is how you can explain the interviewer. And let's look into the examples of API contract and API documentation. Open API documentation contract. This is a contract. This is usually developed by the created by the developers. So when they add some plugins called Swagger and Open APIs in the pom.xml, during the application execution, it generates the API contracts and API documentation will be generated during the application execution. Okay, so these generated documents are very important for the business analyst to validate if they are according to the business requirements or not. So we have to review them before. So this is the first document we have to review, which is called as API contract, and this contract will be developed in collaboration with the technical people, and we define all those all the required fields. So if you just go, if we are reviewing this, let's see, here is the title. Dispute management API is the title, and this is the description. The API contract for transaction search and dispute case creation. It is the same test case, the scenario which we have discussed in the last blog. The initial process begins at the UI, where the user is going to initiate a process to view all the transactions, and an API layer is going to make a call to the database layer to fetch all the eligible transactions, and then the user is going to select one of the transaction, and based off that transaction, with some of the business validations, business rules, it will determine if it has a proper case, if it is a proper dispute, and then it will generate a dispute case unique ID in the backend. So that is the scenario here. So so this is the endpoint URL. Okay, and then there are two things basically. One is transaction and one is dispute. Two parts we are going to verify today. So for the transaction /transaction, it is a get method call. Okay, and this is the brief summary. Get the customer details, and these are all the parameters like the customer ID, account ID, from date, to date, and status. Okay, and status is posted. This is the status, and then these are all sent in the form of a query. If it is in and it is written as query, it is sent as an request parameter queries. It will be sent in the query. It will be concatenated to the query string, and I will show you how the query is going to form. And required is true means this is a mandatory field, and the data type of this mandatory field is string. Okay, so this is how it is defined. This is how the URL is going to be formed. See, if you look at this, this is the parameter request parameters. This is the query string, customer ID, and the value is this. So this is how all the values will get assigned, and all these inputs will be coming from the UI. The user is going to input all these values, the customer ID, account ID, from date, from the date menu, and all these things will be inputted. And once this request string is sent, what the response we are trying to say, if it is 200 series, this is what the description we would like to display it on the UI. And then also we want to encapsulate, like we want to even bundle on some other transaction response into the UI. So dollar reference means there is something down below which is defined. You have to refer to that. So here in this idea, I don't have reference mapping to go to that line number, but I will show you another example in the BS code. It has that feature of going to the line number. So transaction response, right? So for transaction response, these are the components and schema. This is the transaction response. And this is inside the transaction response. This is an object which contains of these three attributes: customer ID, account ID, and transaction. And inside the transaction, it is an array type of transaction which have again component schema. It is calling another object here. So it will go to the here, the control is going to go here, and it's going to define this object. Okay. And then this is how it is going to look. If it is just transaction ID, it's going to give this one as in the UI. But along with this bundled transaction inside this transaction response, this is how the final response is going to look. So this is the customer ID, account IDs, and the transaction which is bundled like this. So this customer ID might contain multiple transactions. So in that case, it will give like this. So as we discussed, like this. Okay, number 2. And these all details will also differs. But as we discussed, right, the customer is going to initiate a view all transactions. This is the response with all the transactions. This is how it is going to display to the UI. And this is for 200 success series, as we saw. For 400, this is how it's going to define get transaction. So instead of from date, for from date, if we gave some string value or characters, it has to throw error, right? So the error code is the invalid date. So for this description, 422, for this description, please throw this error. From date must be YYMMDT format. So like that, they're going to write the coding. They're going to write the APIs. So you have to understand all these things in order to do the data mapping. So in our next blog, I'm going to explain the data mapping, and we're going to deep dive into data mapping, how data mapping works, how can we understand data mapping out of this. Okay. So this is pretty much it with the transaction. Let's go into the dispute. In this dispute, it's a post transaction request call, where it creates a dispute case, and all the fields are required. In this request body, all the fields are required, and this is the schema for the create dispute request. So if you go down here, create dispute request. So this is again an object. All these fields are mandatory, as we seen that mandatory is equal to true. And then these are the properties. and data types of these property of these attributes. And then enum, which gives you an option. So in this post request, uh, it is sending all this request parameters. So you in the UI, end user is going to fill out all the form, dispute form. From the UI point of view, end user is going to fill out all this, and the post request payload contains all everything. So this is how it looks. When he fills out all the form, the post request payload will contain all this information, and the response would be something like, yeah, this is 201 response, right? So the response is calling create dispute response. So again, it comes, the control flow comes here. It will see this response, or then it will understand this is again another object which contains all these attributes. And this is how the response is going to be displayed in the UI or whatever to the another API layer, which will be an input for that another layer, which takes this information and execute them and process them and gives an output to some other API. So yeah, this is pretty much it. This is how it's going to work. And this whole this thing is called as an AML format. AML format. It's usually AML formats are defined in CI/CD pipelines. So these are very easy to understand, this format, and it is mainly for CI/CD pipelines. Even some of the API contracts will be written in JSON format, and this will they will look like this. JSON format will look like this, the same thing. But whereas AML looks like this. See how compact AML looks like and how big JSON look like. So they have lot of formatting brackets and everything, and we have to make sure if one bracket is missing, it will mess up rest of the things. So we have to be careful with the JSON, but usually they follow YAML files. Other than that, yeah, let's get into, yeah, this is where I want to show you when you click on one of the format, like one of the keywords, it will take us to that point. So increase the font, is the settings. Don't see them. Let's not waste the time because I don't want to make this video very lengthy. So this, yeah, this is also open. This is also one of the API contract for dispute management API. And the endpoint is this one. Endpoint URL and description is this, and tags. We have two tags: transaction APIs and dispute APIs. Yeah, it's the same thing what we have seen last time. So for the transaction API, yeah, so this is in the form of a JSON format, and that is in the form of a YAML file. So this JSON format, did you see all these brackets? This is a JSON format API contract. This transaction /transaction, which is a get method call, and these are the attributes for those method calls, and the all these attributes are the request parameters that it's going to send along with the method call. So the request parameters are customer IDs, account ID, and these are all the attribute properties for this particular attribute. These are our different properties for this one property. Okay, attribute. And from date, we saw all these fields, right? And this is the response. So all these attributes gets bundled in the get request call. When we send out a get request call, all these properties will be bundled and will be sent. And when the request is processed properly and it validates against all the business rules and it's been successful, it gives you a response 200. So in the response 200, it is saying you bundle this transaction response. So when we click here, it goes, that is what I meant to say. It has that intelligence to go to that particular method call, and we can directly jump into the method call instead of scrolling down. So transaction response is what is again an object, as I told you, which contains customer ID, account number, and also transaction, which is an array, which contains again elements in elements in the array. The elements usually includes the transaction date, ID, merchant name, amount, currency, and transaction type, status, and all these things here. Okay, let's go back to transaction, one more jump. Okay. Uh, this is the response code. So this is the example. It also given us an example how the response code will look like. Okay. And for 400 series, this is the error response. This is how it's going to send out a response, invalid request. And the description, the example would be like this: request validation failed. Something like this, it will going to send. Coming to coming to dispute, also it is the same thing. Create request. It's going to bundle the create request, and create request has all these objects and attributes, which in turn is mapped to a UI where user is going to fill out all the dispute form. And all the dispute form, whatever the dispute form he's going to look in the UI, it's mapped to this all each and every fields. So that is what we are going to do in the next block. Data mapping is very important. And for understanding the data mapping, this is the prior step that you have to understand. So that is the reason I'm showing this example for you all. So this is how it is going to bundle for the create dispute request, and then for the response, it's going to be create dispute response. This is where it will come, the control comes here and bundles this response and give the response back to the UI. That is pretty much it. I think, yeah, these two are API contracts, and I want to show you the API documentation. So once the API contract, based on the API contract, developers are going to develop their APIs, and along with the APIs, they are going to create this API documentation as well. So in this API documentation, if you see, these are the required request parameters. So for this, if you see, it is just mapping to the transaction get request there. So these are the different parameters that we have saw, and this is where we, as a user, I input everything to get to see all the transactions. Okay. And then based on that request, when we successfully put on all the start date, end date, and everything, right? I don't know if this is this going to let's check this at the end before after we finish explaining this. So the success retrieves the transaction data like this. Okay, this is the transaction, all the transactions. Now it is showing just one transaction data. Okay, if it is something which is not which is a bad request, then it would give you the invalid data. What is the difference between these two? It does not, it seems same to me. I think there is some bug in this. when there is a bad request, this data will not come. It will say invalid transaction or invalid input, right? Unauthorized, it is 500 error. That will be something different error. Yeah. So I think this will not work. So, but anyways, API documentation will look something like this, where we can play around with these input fields. We can put like, 0101 2026, like an end user, even though you don't have a UI to play with, you can come here in the Swagger, enter all the input values, and you can click on execute, which then it will give you the response. Right now the response is error, right? It is throwing a 400 series because I did not provide any information, right? So that's the reason it is giving you the error. So that is where, as a business analyst, your role is to validate this API documentation to ensure all these data fields and all the functionality is matching according to the business requirements. Um, that's it, guys. Please share your comments. If you have any questions, share them in the comments so that I can explain more in depth. And I hope you like this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.